mistakes, and you learn by looking. And I'm a little nervous because actually they're going to make a movie for the sesquicentennial, and they've asked me to do a little blurb there too, so we'll see. This is about 4 men and some women, and their faith and their talents, and how Springfield really falls into this picture. Do you know what this picture is? It's Trinity Church in Manhattan. I walked past it. I worked in the World Trade for 6 years, and I walked past this church, and I only found out by doing this, its address is Wall Street, and Wall Street crossed Broadway. I didn't realize. You know, you walk around these streets, and you go into work, and all you think about is getting to work on time and what have you, so you don't tend to notice them. But it's a very important church for Florida. The story starts with a gentleman by the name of Richard Upjohn. He was an Englishman, and he was born in Shaftesbury, England, which is south of where I'm from. And he was born in 1802. In Shaftesbury, he was apprenticed to a builder and a cabinet maker. I noticed, but I have to look a little, okay. His family, he was an immigrant, immigrated to America in 1829, and initially he settled in Massachusetts. He became a citizen in 1836, and in 1839 he had relocated to New York City, and they'd asked him to come to New York to restore the old Trinity Church. There was a very old Trinity Church there, and the roof was in trouble. So he came to repair the roof. But when he got involved, he found that it was a fool's job, and the idea of doing the restoration was abandoned. So he designed and built a new Trinity Church, which still stands, and it was completed in 1846, and it's pure Gothic, and the only part I'm going to show you a Gothic feature which is really important. You see the arched windows? They're called lancet windows, and that's really an important part of this story. After he built this church, he became so incredibly popular because he was an advocate of building simple wooden churches and buildings, so that people in rural area didn't need to hire an architect or what have you to build like they used to build and take sometimes hundreds of years churches in England. So what he did, he wrote a book, okay? And his book is Upjohn's Rural Architecture, Designs, Working Drawings and Specifications for a Wooden Church and Other Rural Structures. I went to try and get a copy of this book. I know where there is a copy, okay. But when I looked at $1,100, I thought, no, I don't, yes. I think it was only like 3, yes. And Upjohn, it's amazing, along with 13 other architects, formed the American Institute of Architects, AIG. I thought that Lane would be here. She was big in AIG. And he served as the president of that organization from 1857 to 1876. Because of his designs and the effect that it had on churches, amazingly in Florida, one of the churches is a feast day for him. Okay. This is where I put the story of Upjohn. And he was president of AIG from 1857 to 1876, but he died in 1978. But as I talk with the other men, I want you to notice the dates that they existed. It's like a timeline that, you know, that there was... I used to go to the museum with my daughter in Boston, and one of the things that I loved in the rotunda there, they had, it looked like a musical scale, but what they showed was who lived with in history, because you tend to think that each man is in his own time. But it's an incredible thing when you see, like, John Milton was crowned for Galileo and actually went to see Galileo, and you don't think that they were on the same level. So, and then when I was doing this and looking, I found this, the New York Times, August the 16th, 1878, Richard Upjohn, one of the oldest and most prominent architects of this country, died on Friday in the 77th year of his age. Next one. How many people have heard of John Freeman Young? Good. You have to keep quiet, that's my story, right? You get a mark for that. John Freeman Young was born in Maine in 1820. Actually died in 1885. First of all, and much of what I've found here, there's a historian in St. Augustine called Bill Egan, and I will come back to him later in the story. But he did a tremendous amount of research on John Freeman Young, as did an architect that I got to talk to, Charles Patillo. But Charles Patillo passed in 2012, all right? He was originally a Wesleyan, but he converted to Episcopalian and studied at the Virginia Theological Seminary, graduated in 1845. He was ordained a deacon April 20, 1845, and in May he was assigned to St. John's Church in Jacksonville, Florida. The cathedral was not a cathedral then, it was a church, and he was sent here. In between, he filled in other places. I put it in there. He held posts in Texas, in Mississippi. He was responsible for a building of a beautiful church in Mississippi and in Louisiana. But in 1855, Young became the assistant minister at Trinity Church, New York. He honed his extreme interest. This guy had to be brilliant. The more I've read about him, the more brilliant I know he is. And he honed his interest not only in theology, but church architecture and the translating of Christian hymns. He was very heavy into church music, right? While at Trinity, Young became close to Richard Upjohn. In 1867, Reverend Young was consecrated as the second Bishop of Florida. The Church of Florida, he was brought down here after the Civil War. The Church of Florida was in terrible shape after the Civil War, which you can imagine. And it had really almost fallen apart. He was, you know, it's kind of a miracle that they brought him here. But one of the results of him being here was the building of carpenter Gothic churches in Richard Upjohn's style along the river and even into Cuba. He didn't build in Cuba, but he was in Cuba. And he traveled extensively throughout the diocese on horseback or by cart or boat or sailing ship. And you can imagine what it was like in those days. Even to get around the coast, they did what they call cabotage. You know, I had to take a boat to get around and what have we. And during a trip to New York, Bishop Young caught a cold and died of pneumonia. He was only 65 years old, which is rather tragic. But what he put into that short life was absolutely incredible, and we're the beneficiaries. Would you like to know? The reason I found out so much about him, I have a book here that I'm going to talk about, and in it, it pointed to this booklet. It's not very big, it's in 2 sections, and it's John Freeman Young, 2nd Bishop of Florida, Soldier and Servant by this man Pennington. And you know what's beautiful about this? You can pull it down on the internet and you can flip the pages and read it. And there's a lot of stuff written in it that was written by John Freeman Young himself. It's absolutely incredible. So that's why I put that there, and I may come back to it, but you know, if I'm losing you, shout at me, all right? Okay. I talked about Charles Patillo because of something that I'm going to talk about later. I got to talk to Charles Patillo. He was an architect in Jacksonville for 40 years, and then he spent 15 years researching the Carpenter Gothic churches that Reverend Young was responsible for getting built. And his story is so interesting, and I needed it because I wanted to, on one of his pages, and I did buy this book. This book didn't cost over $1,000. And you can see where I've got my papers. In here, he's got a list of the churches that survived. There are two theories here. There was never a St. Dunstan's St. John. But we know that there were 17 churches built, but Charles Patillo thinks that actually it was 18, because he found a record of someone visiting a church somewhere. And it's interesting to read about these churches, but this book was published in 2008. I talked to him in about 2007, and then he passed in 2012. But in here he writes that he was just going to do a history of the Carpenter Gothic churches that were built during John Freeman Young's time. But he said that it would been a boring story, so he turned it into a novel. It's very interesting to read. I haven't read it all yet. But he has conversations going on between John Freeman Young and Richard Upjohn. He followed his designs and what have you. But what he also was seeking, apparently there was a Confederate treasure that was lost, and it was rumored to be in one of these Upjohn churches in Florida. So that's all woven into this story. It's worth reading. This guy, we're talking about men that really had a sincere faith. It's interesting. Okay, can we go to the next one? I hope I'm not forgetting anything. I wrote a little bit about Charlie Patton from what I found. He was so interested. As I said, he spent 15 years researching these churches. And you can see he worked as an architect for 40 years and then spent the 15 years. During his career, he worked on a number of Episcopal churches and parish halls and designed many buildings of Episcopal High School. He was an architect and what have we. But it was always the old wooden churches along the St. John's. And why do you think they were built along the St. John's? You could travel to them. It was easier sometimes by boat. And he said he remembered sitting in the old chapel at Orange Park's Grace Church, built in 1880. I haven't found that church yet, but I don't know if I'm sure it's still there. And he said, I could hear the old hymns and smell the old church wax. It was as if I'd been carried back in time. And Patillo at one time planned to write a book about the 13 churches that survived, but he changed his mind and decided to write a novel. Okay, and he's heavy into John Freeman Young. Although it's a novel, he uses real people in his novel, and the story is built around them. And he talks a lot about John Freeman Young. And then at the end you can see I put a typical Carpenter Gothic of the era was St. Margaret's, built near the river in Hibernia, a community in the southeast corner of Fleming Island. St. Margaret's, Hibernia. It amazed me, it seemed to be the women in the family that built the churches on the family estates. I found that with so many that I was looking about. And Mrs. Fleming was responsible for the establishment and construction of this small church. It was used by her family and guests until St. Margaret's became a church of the Episcopal Diocese of Florida. From the floor plan and construction details, it is obvious that Mrs. Fleming consulted with Bishop Young and followed his architectural preferences. It ought to become. The interesting thing that all these churches were just under 1,000 square feet and followed the same pattern. Can we go on? Here's the church. This is a church we're talking about. And this is classic St. John. You can see the windows, the lancet windows that I talked about in Trinity Church. Sometimes the door was at the end, mostly the door was at the end. But you see the upright, the perpendicular siding, it's called board and batten. And what it was, the boards would be abutted and then the batten would go over the join. And this, you can go visit this church. I've got the address actually if anyone's interested. It's a glorious little church.
Where is it? In Jacksonville?
This one.
Is that one they asked for?
Excuse me. It's on Fleming Island. I'll give you the address. Her family, Margaret Fleming, founded that area, so it's on Fleming Island. But there's one closer than that. All right, if you want to go see an actual. This is a page from Wayne Wood's book. I knew that there was a church that had been moved into a park in Jacksonville, and I couldn't find it. And Joel and I go back, 90 years now. In fact, it's because of Joel that I did this, because Joel had called me, I think either before or after we were working on the fountain, and he said, "There's a church inside a house on Hubbard, and I want you to go find it." Okay. So anyway, what's interesting about this is also a woman. You see here, other Episcopal churches built along the St. John's River during the 1800s reflect the Carpenter Gothic style. This was also a woman, Mrs. Stevens. She moved here from Minnesota, and she built this. The reason Wayne Wood's got this in his book, the church was moved 3 times to save it. And then when I went looking, it still wasn't settled. After Wayne's book, it moved one more time by boat. And it belongs to San Marco Historical Society, and it's in Fletcher Park. You can see it's the same style, but this time the little door is at the end. And what have we? I think it was moved again in 1994, but I think it's found a permanent home now. But you can visit that church too. It's a beautiful church. There's a photograph of it next. Here it is. Aren't they gorgeous? Yes. They're so simple and so beautiful, and you can see the batten board, and of course they have to give wheelchair access now, but that stands in Fletcher Park on Atlantic Boulevard. I think I put it, I'm not even reading my notes, so I hope I don't forget stuff. Okay, very slowly. Now we go to the second part of my story. We all know this map, don't we? This is the Koch map from 1893. Isaac Parkinson, let me find, well, I'm going to talk about the map first of all. I'll come around. Can you see just below 5th? There's a little building. Do you see the little building? And then you see the house. There was a gentleman named Isaac Parkinson, and about 1884 he built his house at the corner of 4th and what is now Hubbard, but at that time it was called Adeline. But when he built his house, he also put a little Sunday school in his backyard. Yes, it's a wonderful story. Just give me a moment. Actually, that church in Fletcher Park is St. Paul's, if you're looking for it. You know what happens to a building when it's put into the park? it actually starts to belong to the park and anyone. And they have an arrangement at the San Marco Historical Society kind of claim ownership to it, but it really belongs to everyone because it's in a city park. You know, Koch's map, in some ways it's useful, but the size of the buildings are so distorted and not all buildings are in there. For instance, the city blocks are the same as they are now, and they're approximately 450 feet by 450 feet, so you can see how big that would be. Can we go on to the next one? Now this, I don't know where I got this newspaper cutting, all right? It came from Joel, I can't remember. But this actually has been a bit of disappointment to me, and I'll explain later. But in the bottom, this piece where I've put a little bracket, it says St. Mary's, which is the church that we know today on Laura, was organised in the old Parkinson home, and it says right, on Hubbard Street at the corner of 4th. The house was later moved from the corner to its present location, making room for an apartment house. After holding services in 2 other houses, St. Mary's bought the house at the left, you can't see it in the trees, and which was also owned by the Parkinson family. That was the little mission. And worship services were held at that location for 20 years before moving to the present location at 9th and Laura Street. It kind of leaps my story a little bit by having this. What's amazing, you could see that little building, and you'll see later, was probably 12 feet square. But by the time they were ready to move, they had 112 members. I wonder how many, so can we go to the next one? And this is where I talked about Isaac. This is another Englishman. He was a graduate of Cambridge, England, and in 1886 directory, Parkinson is shown as living in Springfield at the corner of Adeline, that's what Hubbard used to be called, Adeline and 4th Street, which dates the house to about 1884 or 5. You have to realise that when you look at those directories, they collected the material at least a year before, maybe 2 years, and then they dated the directory by the year it was published. So many of these houses in Springfield are at least a couple of years older than the directory said. But anyway, that's what it was. And the centennial booklet of St. John's Parish Church states it's 1934. It appears that as early as 1888. The history in St. Mary's on Laura actually says 1887, which is a situation again of the thing. A Sunday school was established by St. John's in the northern part of the city, now known as Springfield, and was called St. Mary's Sunday School, and from this Sunday school a mission grew. I don't like that it says that it was established by St. John's, because it wasn't. It was established by a group of Springfielders, really. Later it came. And then I looked at the Florida Times Union. If you ever go down to the library, if you go to the Florida Times Union books, and as the older they get, it's more difficult. But the early part of the 20th century, it's full of Springfield stories in the index. It's amazing what you find. But it said, it's talking about the little mission. It said the land on which it stood was given the mission, but a token rent was charged for the house on the site. That's a little building. The building was valued at $360, and once the mission paid that amount in rent, it took 4 years. It was given ownership of the entire property by Mrs. Parkinson's daughter, Mrs. Charlotte Parkinson Holland, who also was active in the new mission. During this period, the mission became St. Mary's Chapel, and the building was the first church owned by St. Mary's. As Springfield grew, so did St. Mary's. By 1908, the chapel decided to look for larger quarters. It's amazing how, Springfield's a close community now, but that community really worked on this. Are you with me? I'm not losing you, no? Yes. And the centennial booklet also states, and this one worries me a little, On September 11th, 1911, the action of the vestry of the parish, St. Mary's became an independent mission, and the right and title of all the parish to all property used in connection with the mission was relinquished. Finally, on May 13th, 1913, St. Mary's, with the approval of the mother parish, became an independent parish known as the Rector, Wardens and Vestry of St. Mary's Church. I should say Springfield, Florida, instead of Jacksonville, Florida. But I know that by 1911, just by what I've looked at, that the church had already been built on Laura Street. All right? Remember I told you that Joel called me and said, there's a church inside a house. Then I got another call from him, and he said, Chris, that house that has a church inside is on the next HPC meeting up for demolition. This is about 2007 or 8, maybe 8. And it had been sold, and you move to the next picture. It stood, at one time they were divided, but it stood on the same property of this house, which was 1421, and the little mission house was 1423. And Jerry and Julia, they bought this property, and they wanted to restore the house. So you can see the blue sign. It was on the HPC agenda, and also part of the request was the ability to restore the house, but demolish the house that stood on the ground next door to it. And you know what had happened in the time? When the inspector went to look at this house, he looked at the little house and said, what's that? They had no record of it. It was, anyway, I might get a bit tearful, guys, okay. Can we go on to the next one? What happened at that HPC meeting, and Louise Warren came down with me to speak at the meeting, and she was the one that really taught me about Carpenter Gothic churches. Right? So when the item came up on the agenda, I stood up, and of course it wasn't stripped out by that time, and I said, please, there's a very old little mission church inside this house. Anyway, when I stood up and spoke, and Louise Warren stood up and spoke with me, Jerry and Julia, Pegram their names, remember, they've moved away now. But anyway, they were not aware that this existed in their side yard. And so I made this appeal. I'd already tried to get a quote on moving the entire house. And to move the entire house would have been $50,000. So we set up, and can you believe at that time, in about 1907, 1908, we really didn't have a restoration group. And this HPC committee, the guy that was in charge of the committee stood up and he said, well, we'll give you a couple of months to get it moved. And he said to Jerry and Julian, if they don't get it moved, pull it down, if it doesn't fall down in the meantime. If this was happening now, it would be safe. It would be safe. But you're looking at the back of it. This is the back onto Hubbard. You know where I am on Hubbard. You know the house next door, John, and what have we. Anyway, can we go to the next one? Can you see what good shape it was in? I mean, this had stood for almost 100 years. Look at the footings and look at the woodwork. The only problem is that the windows weren't mansard windows. And if you go to the next one, the next picture, this is the front of it. You're looking at a little Gothic church, aren't you? And actually, that's how I got to talk to Charlie Patillo, because Pat Mountain and I had gone to see the bishop at the cathedral to ask, please help us save this little mission church. They knew of it. And it was that point that the bishop pulled out John's book. They'd got it in his library, all right? But we couldn't get anybody to help us. And it was just the time that it was, and Charlie Patillo did call me, and he agreed, you know, that it was a lovely old building, but you really couldn't call it Commons or Gothic, you know. But the building was 100 years old, and it had such a history. So the building went down, and it went down because I went to see Darryl to ask if we could move this little mission into the park. In fact, I walked the park in front of the coppice, except we would have had to put it higher. And like when we were trying to do the track, we couldn't get an answer from the park, you know. So he's there, and they did not want a derelict building in the park. You know, it wouldn't have taken much to restore it, I can tell you that. And then when we found out, it wasn't me, but there was kind of strife between the two organisations, that if it went into the park, the idea was if we put it in the park, we could use it to sell tickets with it all, you know, or for confections. But when some person found out that even if SIA paid to move it, it wouldn't have cost that much to move this. When I was looking at this, I thought, why didn't I pay to move that into my driveway at the back? I think it's a little bit too wide, you know. And when it was found out that it would be everybody's building, went down. I have to tell you that, before you leave tonight, go into the kitchen. The ceiling of that little church is the ceiling in the kitchen. So there's a little bit of it. To the next one. And this is what it is today. This is a restored house. And now there's a fence. Jerry and Julie sold this house, and I thought it could have been moved further back, but it's very sad. Can you imagine if we had that now? Yes. Can we move on? And here we go. This is St. Mary's on Laura. This is the church that grew out of the mission. The group of people that were part of that mission. I mean, they fundraised, and they were able to sell the land. They already owned the land that the little mission stood on, because remember, Robinson's daughter had given it to them for a small rent. And so they had the money to buy the land at 9th and Laura. So, and they could build these things so fast in those things. And the only thing about this, you notice its siding is horizontal. It's not the board and batten, which you see. Look at those lovely lancet windows all down the side. Isn't this a gorgeous building? I mean, it's so precious in Springfield. And I had not really gone too close to it before. But I went over there, and I couldn't take a decent photograph all day because the gate was locked. And then I went over in, and the groundsman was there. So he let me in, and so I took photographs, and then he said, would you like to go inside to look at it? Everyone should go look at the inside of that church. Let me go to the next picture. Look at it. And can you see how the walls are done inside? They've done like the board and batten siding, and the lancet windows, and the floor in the main part has been covered, redone, but the floor in where the altar and at the end, it's original. It is absolutely gorgeous. And you know, when these chandeliers were hung, when they put a ladder against those cross pieces, you think that they're supporting the roof. They're not. When the ladder went against them, they moved, okay? You know why? The building is balloon built. The roof is holding the walls in this building. It's the same with that building there. The roof, and I'm not an architect, but it's holding the walls. But isn't that a glorious church? There's another picture. Sorry?
What denomination is it? Episcopal.
I don't, it's Episcopal, yes. Can we move on? I think there's another, yeah, I took another picture of it. The ceiling is incredible. Can we move on one more time? And this is the altar. I went up close to the altar. You know what bothered me though? And I should say this. The front doors to this church are original. Those front doors are well over 100 years old. And they're thick, so thick. And there's so much paint on there, I thought, my God, I wonder what they'd be like, you know, if they took the paint off. But also, if you remember the picture, those lovely strap hinges, I think they're original too. And guess what? They've been painted gold. Yeah, well, I even said to the guy, I said, well, did you paint these hinges? I shouldn't. But it is, and you see the hoops at the top. They're neon lights in the ceiling. Pale blue neon lights. Okay, can we move on? I don't think I'm forgetting anything. But this is the little write-up that I did. I'm glad I did these write-ups because it really helps me. And I stated earlier from an FTU cutting, during the years of 1908 and 1909, the lot on Hubbard Street was sold, and partly with the proceeds, the property at the northwest corner of 9th and Laura was acquired, and the building erected for the mission. It's difficult to pinpoint the actual move, and I'll tell you why it is. Sometimes the directories are not clear, but the 1911 book shows a George Henry Harrison residing at 9th and Laura. So I went looking, and he was a reverend. And they put the church in the directory under his name. So it dates that church in about 1909, okay, I believe. It appears that Springfield has always been a close community. The following excerpts from the FTU, I love these, show. And September 7th, 09, there was a social tea at Mrs. Redding's. I've seen Mrs. Redding's name in the archives, okay? And at the home of Mrs. W.A. Redding, 255 West 4th Street, Springfield, the ladies of St. Mary's Guild will give a tea Thursday afternoon from 4 to 6 o'clock. These ladies will be glad to welcome all who are interested in the building fund of St. Mary's Church. During the afternoon, there will be an excellent musical program, and a present time is promised all. So we saw it. And then the next one, it's a peanut hunt. This afternoon, November 13th, from 3 to 5 p.m, there will be a peanut hunt for St. Mary's School for the benefit of the building fund at the residence of Mrs. Herbert A. Inley, 1523. Now would be 1323. The house still stands. 255 it doesn't. The other house doesn't. Ionia. A small admission fee of 6 cents will be charged, and there will be delicious homemade candy on sale. St. Mary's School and all of their friends are most cordially invited to attend, and a pleasant afternoon is promised all. Okay, that was a fundraiser. I pulled this from the 85 survey because it's such a beautiful photograph at the front of that church. I mean, it shows the front door and the strap hinges and the lancet windows. Okay, do you know this house?
Yes.
What is it?
It's on West 4th.
Sorry?
It's on West 4th.
Yes, it's on West 4th. It's the Ramona. It's the Ramona. And the reason I pulled it, I went over there to try and get a decent photograph, but there's usually so many cars in front of it that I couldn't get it. But this house was built by Frank Gray, who started as a clerk with S.B. Hubbard and rose to be vice president. You want to go to the next one? I put it here. In the 1880s, he was found living at 816 West Adams Street in the villa, and his mother, Mrs. Annie Gray, also resided there. Circa 1890, they moved to their new Springfield house. First address was 4th and Main, which tells me that they owned the whole block at that time. And it's now the Ramona at 34 West 4th. And below the obituary from the minutes of the Women's Auxiliary. Mrs. Annie E. Gray passed into the better land early in the morning of Sunday, November the 30th, 1919. She was identified with the Upbuilders parish from the very beginning. In 1875, she established a Sunday school at her own home in La Villa, which eventually grew to be St. Stephen's Mission. Upon moving to Springfield around 1891, they say, she took up work in St. Mary's Sunday School, then being conducted on Hubbard Street. It was from this Sunday school that St. Mary's Mission sprang, contributed in no small measure by former members of St. Stephen's Mission. Although in advanced years and infirm health, Mrs. Gray was a real force in the establishment of his parish. I understand that St. Stephen's Parish in the Villa was integrated, which at that time, yes. That's another thing about John Freeman Young that I told you, is that while he was busy building these churches, he tried to get the children of freed slaves into the churches to learn the theology and the music. I mean, he was a wonderful man. And then my own note says, these missions were the godchildren of some very dedicated people. They really were. Can you pass on? I don't speak any German. What does it say? Yeah, how do you pronounce it? Stille Night? Do you know why it's there? Do you know why I've got it there? John Freeman Young is renowned throughout the kind of English-speaking and in Europe because he translated this into the English carol Silent Night. That's the thing that he's really known for. Can you move on? This is a stained glass window, and I talked about Bill Egan, the historian from St. Augustine. I found this on his page and it said there that he'd taken the photograph, so I'm very careful. I was nervous about downloading it, but then I found it elsewhere. All right, so I did download it, but we can't show it, all right? Okay. Yeah. Can we go to the next one? And this is from Bill Egan. It says here, Silent Night, the song heard around the world. You know what's amazing? 200 years ago, last Christmas Eve, was the first time that the carol in the German was sung in Austria. So it's kind of good that we're looking at it now. It was Christmas Eve, last Christmas Eve 2018, the carol Silent Night, Holy Night was heard for the first time in Oberndorf, Austria on December the 24th, 1818. Joseph Moore journeyed to the home of musician schoolmaster Franz Gruber in a village named Arnsdorf. He showed him his poem that he'd written in 1816 to Gruber and asked him to add a melody and guitar accompaniment so that it could be sung at midnight mass. There is a museum to Gruber, and true to form, that as years progressed, no one would believe that Gruber wrote that music, but then they found in Moore's notes saying that the music was attributed to them. And this is where John Freeman Young comes in. In 1859, Reverend Young published a 16-page pamphlet titled Carols for Christmas Tide. The first of 7 carols in this pamphlet was the English translation of the Austrian hymn under the title Silent Night, Holy Night. 2 years after his death, the cornerstone of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, and we know where that stands, and you go and look at it, it is Gothic. It was dedicated at the stone, the cornerstone was laid, and the church was a memorial to Bishop Young. And the land upon which the church was built was a gift from John N.C. Stockton, Bishop Young's brother-in-law. he was married twice. His first wife died in 1877. Then he married Mary Stockton, who was the sister of Telfair Stockton. If you go look, between him and Hubbard, it seems like they seem to own most of this verse. And Egan noted in 2003, Egan noted that while the graves of Maud and Gruber are the site of annual Christmas services and pilgrims flock to their well-kept graves, Egan also wrote of the terrible condition of Young's grave. It was an awful condition. After his article, the graves were restored, and representatives of the Silent Night Society of Salzburg placed greens on Young's grave. And the reason I haven't put it in here is because his first wife is in the grave with him, Hannah. And her grave at that time was tipped over, and the place was a big mess. And then when Bill Higgin published his notes, everybody kind of woke up, and actually Emily Liska paid to have Mrs. Young's gravestone whited and cleaned and what have we. And I haven't told you yet where it is, but anyway, this will tell you a little bit and then I'll show you. Do you remember Shannon Palmer? She used to live on Laura. They moved to Hong Kong, I believe. But at one time, she became very, very interested in the old city cemetery. I mean, she gave tours. I took a tour, and it was incredible, absolutely incredible. And then something happened. You know, it's difficult to deal with the city. We all know that. And so she walked away from it. But as part of this, she arranged for a group to go to Young's grave. This is about 10 years ago. And we all went up there. And Doug van der Laan played the guitar. And Mr. Egan came up from St. Augustine. And we were singing Silent Night. And the original German was sung. But what you don't realize about Freeman Young, he translated hymns into 4 languages. The guy was really brilliant in his translations. And I read elsewhere that Mary Young was the sister of Telfair Stockton. I also read that one reason that Freeman Young had success building the churches was because the Stockton family chipped him money. You know, he had this side money. Here it is. It sits in the old city cemetery. And actually his wife's grave is just above this, but Mary isn't there. It's his first wife, Hannah, that's there. And when I went up to photograph, sure enough there are wreaths on there. And I went looking to see if there was a label to tell me who put them on there, but there wasn't. But I'm pretty sure it's that Silent Night Society, and I think it's funded from Austria. And you know, that old cemetery is so beautiful. If you want to go look at his grave, it's simple to find. It's simple to find it. If you go right to the end of Walnut Street, you make a right, and about 50 feet down, you have to make a left, and keep going. You go past Jenny, there's a road, Jenny, until you reach State. Then you make a left on State, and about 100 feet along, there's a big opening. You can drive your car into the cemetery, and you just go up the hill, and on the right-hand side is the graves. You find the graves of the Confederate soldiers, which the Sons of the Confederacy, they were thrown all over the place the first time. They went and found them, and it's clean. And then there's like a gazebo, but their graves are on this side, and then if you look to the left, you can see Freeman Young. It's very simple to get to, you know. I come back to this because I'm a little bit annoyed with this newspaper article. You know, I went trying to find where it was published, but it's difficult. It could have been published anytime, you know. And it's in this article that it says that Yellow House, it stands at the corner of 4th and Hubbard, you know. I think it might be a quad. It was sold recently and it's being restored. Go to Hubbard and Forth and you'll see it. And they decided that this was a Parkinson house. I know why that happened, because when streets got their names changed, when it went from Adeline to Hubbard, Parkinson's house was still standing there, but they numbered it and they called it 1607 Hubbard, which became 1407 when they dropped down. And when this building, and I don't know whether you move a building and then take the roof and change it, what tells me is that the roof is wrong. And it was 1607 and 1609, so the people doing the research, and it's easy to do, assumed that this was a Parkinson house, because when the Parkinson house first took a number, it was 1607 Hubbard, and here we have 16. Mind you, I might have to dig a bit more, because it certainly looks like the main part, but the roof is wrong. This is it. If you remember in the cot, it's not a triangular roof. You know, there's the two walls, and then the roof goes up. But there aren't side walls to the roof. The sides of the house go up to a point to meet the roof. Excuse me, where this one, you can see it's got the what's it called, where the fascia board is around there, and it's a different shaped roof. And I'm going to have to talk to Joel, because when I was first looking for this, I said to Joel, we've got to watch that house, because I think it's dated in the late teens or somewhere around there, and we need to watch it because it's an old house. It's an old house anyway. But guess what? It wasn't picked up in the survey. So can we go on to the next one? I did this again to show you. You see what I mean by the roof? The roof slopes up at the front and down at the back, but there isn't a roof on the side. You know how? I think it's when I get close to that. Okay. Let's go to the next one. And this is what I wanted you to see. 1903, that's 1903 Sanborn. You can see St. Mary's Mission. Can you see it was on a separate piece of land? And you can see the Parkinson house on the corner. That's on the corner of 4th and Hubbard. You know, people think that we weren't hurt by the fire. I think Springfield was hurt terribly by the fire, because before the fire, we had big homes on big pieces of land. And I really think maybe the real wealth was in Springfield at that time, before the fire. And then after the fire, they were so desperate to provide housing, they were building houses so fast that if you look at the 85 survey, over 600 of the houses built before 35 survived to 85. I don't know how many now. But if you're talking 600 houses over a period of 10 years, they were building houses at the Bay better than one a week. And they were the ones, you know, they hadn't survived. So those houses were going up, pa, 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 pa. And the streets were so straight, and all these newly rich, let's say, that's when wealth really left. If you look in Wayne Wood's book, there's a photograph of a house, a huge mansion on Main Street. Main Street had huge mansions on it, and this man, Charles Blum, was a wine merchant, and that's when Springfield lost, you know, Main Street. There was only one or two of the houses left that were on there. But now look at 1913, and look what's happened in 10 years. There's a little mission at the top. There, below it is the house that was bought. It's divided at the moment. This is the one that Julie and her husband bought. Then there's that square one is a bungalow. There's actually a rooming house today. It's a nice bungalow. And then you can see, this is the yellow house there. And then look how this house is built around it. And you can see what happened. It went from an estate with a little church in its backyard to packed in, but that's happened so much. I found out while doing this that this is the rectory to St. Mary's. In fact, in England, and actually the newspaper here, it's called the Manse, all right? Now, there's a judge in Jacksonville. His name's Peter Deering. He's a lawyer and a judge. He's restoring this building. And I know that because he went to Louisa Becker and asking all the law firms if they would chip in to ask him to help restore it. And quite frankly, this is beautiful prairie. Can you see the gorgeous columns on it? The square column. This has been filled in the front here. I ought to go over and take another photograph of it. But the intent is that when it's restored, it'll be housing, I believe, for like seminary students and what have you. But between St. Mary's and if this is restored, it would be a great place to have a Christmas tour, a holiday tour. It's been on the spring tour, but it would be good. I think maybe I've got to the end. Near something, yeah. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. I'll get home and I'll think, oh, I should have told them that, but I can't talk to them. Thank you.
Thank you.